Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, my name is Terrance Green, as Dr. Heilig said, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy. And I'm honored to be here with you all tonight. And so thank you for having me in your space. I'd like to thank everyone that was involved in getting me here. Dean Sidorka, thank you so much for everything. Christy and Tina and Julian, thank you very much. Tonight, I want to talk to you about community-based innovations in education. And before I begin, I just want to let you know I only have like 15 to 20 minutes, so this won't be exhaustive. This won't be the end-all, be-all, but this is more of an introduction, okay? So to begin our conversation tonight, because I don't want to just talk at you, I would love to talk with you. I want to begin with this picture, this diagram. So if you were to look through the camera, what do you think is going on here? Let that sink in for a second. What do you think is happening? What's going on here? All right, so we're looking through the camera. What's happening? Talk to me. Just raise your hands, popcorn, shout it out. What do you think is happening? Yes?
It's like he's feeding them a piece of pizza.
Somebody's being fed pizza. What else? What else do you think you see? Hot stab. What else? Pizza, stab. Somebody's filming it. Yep, but what's happening inside of the actual camera? What do you think is happening? So we got pizza. People are eating pizza. We got somebody getting stabbed. What else is happening? Yes?
Violence.
There's violence. What else do you think is happening?
Dancing.
They're dancing. All right, now, yes, they're dancing. What else do you think could be potentially happening?
Laughter.
They're laughing. All right, so let's play this out. Let's go with the line of thinking that which I typically get folks say that someone is getting stabbed. So we're going to play that line of thinking out. Who do you think is the aggressor in this picture? Which person is the aggressor? This person or this person? The first person we will say will be the aggressor, and we'll say this person will be the victim. All right, if we got a clear understanding of that, everybody say, oh, yeah?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So now, when we take a global, more macro perspective, more than just the lens that's been given to us, we see a number of things. Number one, who we thought was the aggressor is actually the victim, and the person that we thought was the victim is actually the aggressor. And that brings up this first point, is that new ways of seeing can create new ways of being. And so it's incumbent upon us, when we're talking about working in community-based spaces, to throw down deficit notions of community, racist ideas, in disruptive ways of looking at families and communities and schools and children that have been given to us. The second thing that's so important about this is that all community-based work, it functions within a system, a globalized system of oppression, a globalized system of white supremacy, a globalized system of inequity, and there are actors who are particularly invested in maintaining that inequitable power dynamic because they see children as instruments of profit. Right? And so what we have to do before we talk about community-based innovation, we have to, number one, remember that new ways of seeing create new ways of being, and number two, that we're up against this systemic oppressive condition which we can push back on. Right? And so what we want to do now is shift our thinking away from these narrow notions that there is an achievement gap to more broader perspectives to understand the ways in which opportunity gaps shape people's lifestyles and everything that they engage in. So when we think about this quote from Wellner and Prudence Carter, they said the opportunity gap shifts our attention from outcomes to inputs. Thinking in terms of the achievement gap emphasizes symptoms, but thinking about unequal opportunities highlights the causes. So when we start thinking about community-based interventions, I want us to step back and try to address and disrupt opportunity gaps. And so when we start thinking about opportunity gaps, we realize there is an achievement gap, but there's an inequitable schools gap. There's this idea that there's an inequitable teacher training gap. How in the world do you have teachers being trained to work with children of color and they don't understand anything about their culture? They don't understand anything about equity. That's inequity. That is a gap from the get-go before you even get in the classroom, right? We have a challenging curriculum gap. We have a racial wealth gap. We have an affordable housing gap. We have a digital gap, and we also have a health care gap. But now, what's so important, Asa Hilliard, one of the most brilliant educational psychologists to ever walk this earth, he said something that was so profound. He said, these conditions shape students' opportunities to learn, not their capacities to learn. So when we start thinking about community-based innovations, we're thinking about people who understand the capacity and the brilliance of our babies and of our children and what our families and what they can do, and that these just shape opportunities, which we're going to push back on, but not the capacity of our brilliant babies to learn. Right? So now, what has the federal government done in terms of the U.S. Department of Education, just like the dean said? There, for the last 35 years, we've been engaged in these top-down education reforms that just have not worked. They have not worked for poor communities, communities of colors, communities that have been systemically, continually, historically, and contemporarily oppressed. They have not worked. And they have not worked for a number of reasons. Number one, they're standard-based. Number two, they're predicated on the idea of competition. And this is why competition is problematic. Competition presupposes that there are winners and there are losers. And we know historically how the system has been set up for who to win and who to lose, right? And so we get these models, for example, like this, that there are only 6 ways for parents to be involved in their child's life. And so what this says that if you're not engaged in one of these 6 areas, then you're not involved. But we don't go back to investigate the research from which this comes from is predicated on white middle-class notions of what involvement means. And there has to be something more than involvement just because you volunteered at the school at 11 o'clock in the afternoon. What does that mean? Right? So we have to push back on that. And so what's been happening around the country, there have been tensions emerging. Tensions on one hand where people are frustrated, they're tired, may I be so kind as to say they're pissed off at the way that top-down education reforms have come and they haven't worked. But then on the other hand, there's this tension that urban spaces that have been oppressed are not just places of oppression and systemic inequity, but they're also places of transformation and possibility. That people, they live in the midst of that paradox, understanding I can live in both and that tension to push back and to do something about the community-based space in which they're living. So this is where we get this notion of these bottom-up reforms. And when I say bottom-up, these are people that are looking for contextual interventions. They're trying to figure out what is the intervention for my context. There may not be this blueprint for it. There may not be this one magical thing that everybody does, but they're trying to figure out contextual interventions, ultimately working for structural transformation. Right? So that's the idea. The idea is to work to have structural transformation, but community-based intervention begins with folks saying, hey, what can I do here now to stop massive school closures? What can I do now to stop all the teachers from getting fired? What can I do now for all the charter schools coming in and taking over the public schools that we did? Like, what can I do now? The contextual intervention working to this larger idea of structural transformation. All right, so when we think about this idea of community innovation, I think it's important for us to historically contextualize this work. This ain't new. People in communities engaged in innovative projects and works and pushing back and resisting is not a new phenomenon. This is a revisitation of what people of color have been engaged in since we've been in this place, right? So is this idea that before Brown v. Board, that there were these African American communities that always found ways, in many communities of color, poor communities, they found ways to provide education within the schoolhouse and sometimes outside of the schoolhouse. We even got Highlander Folk School here down in Nashville area, where Miles Horton is arguing that the people with the problems are the people with the solutions. There's this idea that communities are not problems, but communities are indeed solutions. So when we think about things that are going on in a contemporary setting, when we think about community-based people that are being innovative and pushing back, we have to look at the Journey for Justice Alliance with G2 Brown 24 cities, grassroots areas, two places globally where they're engaged in these grassroots areas to provide equitable educational opportunities for black and brown children in their neighborhoods, right? We've got to think about the Racial Justice Now Coalition in Dayton, Ohio, where these black parents are working on advocacy, where they're working on school policy, where folks are aggregating and they're combining their resources and their activism to provide these contextual interventions as they're working for this larger structural transformation. We've got to look at what Kimberly Bryant is doing in terms of coding, right? We're understanding how this system is set up, but understanding how black girls, which they told her to take out of the name, can code, right? Is this idea that this is an affirmation that black girls can code these innovative practices that may not be happening in schools, but people realize that there's a need for us to push back and resist. And of course, we can't talk about community-based innovators without talking about what happened at Dyett High School in Chicago, the 34-day strike to have a world-class community school that is democratically run and controlled by the folks of that community. This is community-based innovation. We also need to look at the work that's happening in Milwaukee with Go For It and Asset Builders of America, teaching black youth how to aggregate resources in a socially democratic way where it's shared. And then the great work that Chris Emdin is doing with the Science Hip Hop Academy, teaching students how to use hip hop and how to use rap in terms of being more engaged with science. Thinking about community-based innovations to circumvent what's happening in schools. So when we think about this idea of community innovations, what I've seen is that they collide at this nexus, or they collide at this intersection, that number one, they're people, there's this deep frustration and desire to see equitable social change, right? There's that idea that the way things have been going, we can't have this anymore. Not only do they want to make change, but the change that they want to make is equitable change, right? There's also this idea, I don't know why it's not showing up here, but I looked at it, it looked very well, but you can't see it. The next row that's coming is this idea of community activism, that these individuals are engaged, they're active in their community. It's not enough just to see something wrong, but there has to be some action to address it. But then there's this idea where people are taking their skill sets. They're saying, you know what? I may not have been trained at XYZ University, I may not have these experiences, but I do have a whole heck of a lot. And when we aggregate those and when we work together, we can start to solve some problems. And this is one of the critiques of institutions of higher education, not this one, but broadly, is that we analyze problems, but we don't know how to do nothing about them. We ask questions, but we don't know how to answer a question, right? And so these are people who are frustrated with those traditional notions of just talking about more theory and more research. You need theory, you need research, but if the theory and the research is the sum total of what you're engaged in, then your work ends at this big old experience that you have is just a privilege of you gaining more information and more knowledge. Right? But then there's this other intersection where people, they become conscious. They become racially conscious, they become socially conscious, they become politically conscious, and they see the nexus where these areas collide in this idea of community innovation. So now, here's something that I always tell my students in class. It's not enough to just critique and oppose, but you have to take that a step further. You have to create and propose. Right? So on the one hand, it's one thing to just critique and oppose. Oh, this is so bad. All the top-down strategies and But then, like, what's your suggestion? What's your alternative? How might this be done differently? And so when we think about community-based innovation, these are people who augment their critique and their deconstruction with the reconstruction and the recreation of more equitable opportunities, institutions, structures, pedagogy, so on and so forth. Right? So here's some work that I've been engaged in for a number of years, working with community schools across the United States. And the community schools, Journey for Justice is pushing for 10,000 sustainable community schools across this nation. Right? It's this idea where people can come democratically gather and decide what should be the curricula. They can decide how things should be taught. Like, what is the neighborhood's dream for this school, right? And the community schools that I've worked with, they've been able to achieve results in 2 to 3 years that schools under just top-down mandates have not been able to do because they have not incorporated the humanization, the humanizing elements of children and their families, right? So it's this idea in Eurocentric notions of education that we just sever the head from everything else, and it's all about intellect. But the human capacity of people have more needs than just the accumulation of more knowledge, right? And I can talk to you more about some of the amazing work that they've been able to do. The school, Jones High School, they were able to increase their graduation rates 30%, which, is not all about graduation rates, but that is a metric in which people are, judged on and assessed on, and is important if somebody wants to go to post-secondary education. So yeah, that's important. Yeah, you need to improve the graduation rate. And not just the graduation rates, the acceptance into post-secondary institutions where people have the opportunity and the choice to pursue that if they so choose, right? Been doing some amazing work. And this is what we found, that reforms start in and with the community. That's where reform begins. It doesn't begin at whatever, Washington Avenue or Pennsylvania Avenue. Reforms begin in and with communities. And how do we think about the ways in which that unfolds? And so in my work, as I come to a conclusion, what I've found is that community-based innovators at the root is this notion of Freirean dialogue. And Freire talks about these 5 tenets. And this first one is that you must, if you're going to engage in community work and community-based, and you're going to work with people and not work on people, you must first have a profound love for people. Like you can't teach somebody you're scared of. Right? So there's this profound love that you have for people, that you don't see them as a deficit and as a deficient. You see their gifts and their strengths and what they bring. The second idea is that there's this faith in people, that you have faith in people to name and transform their current realities. This third idea about having this critical hope, that you see inequity and oppression as not deterministic, but rather opportunistic. Right? Then there's this idea of critical consciousness, that you develop and you gain this critical consciousness to understand the ways in which the world works and how it constrains decisions. But then finally, you come to people with a sense of humility, recognizing that you don't have all the answers, and recognizing that we know more collectively than any one of us know individually. Right? So it's this idea about these community actors. They're grappling in democratic ways to figure out, what do we do to stop school closures? What do we do to provide equitable educational opportunities? What do we do to stop home foreclosures in the neighborhood, which impact mobility rates, right? What do we do? Then there's this idea around developing strategic partnerships. And those partnerships, the coalition building that I've seen is that people only build with coalitions after they've established a solid base, right? Because you run the risk, if you're a community-based organization, of being co-opted, right? So it's this idea of developing these partnerships to gain, you understand the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of resources, the sharing of power in the ways in which it interacts at multiple levels. Then there's this idea that we're constantly engaged in taking critically reflective action, that we're acting, but we're reflecting on the action in which we're engaged in to make sure that the work we're doing is not doing harm and is really equitable. And then finally, there's this idea of, like, how do we start to institutionalize the community-based work in which we're engaged in, right? So this idea, how do we build broad-based systems and organizations to sustain this work as we continue to do it? So, I'm done. This is my last little quote. I'm done. We're going to bring the panel up. It's this idea by M.K. Asante. He says this. He says, new observations require new obligations. So in other words, when you observe an issue occurring in community, like, it's not enough to just observe it, but now that observation has to become an obligation to push back on that systemic inequity or oppression that's shaping the impact in the lives of children and families. That's it. That's it.